Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. I'm gonna be interviewing my friend, Comrade JB. He's from the Israeli Communist Party, and he's gonna be telling us about the situation going on in Israel and Palestine right now. It's very good that you could make it and come talk to me about this, because obviously the situation in Palestine is ongoing. But in case there are people who have been living under a rock, could you briefly begin by explaining what even is the whole conflict between Israel and Palestine, and how it came about, and then go on to what's happening right now?
So briefly, there was this thing in the last century called the Zionist movement. Started even actually in the 19th century, which was essentially a bourgeois nationalist movement for Jews, primarily from Europe, although it later spread to the rest of the world. So essentially, Jewish settlers from primarily Europe again started settling and migrating from all these different countries into first Ottoman-controlled and then British-controlled Palestine. Palestine is the region in the Levant between Syria and Egypt. Now, at the same time of all these migrants coming, or settlers, there was also the local Arab-speaking populations, primarily Muslim, later on started coalescing around the Palestinian national movement. And these two nationalist movements started competing with one another over control of the region. You had the indigenous people, the Palestinians, and you had the Jewish settlers, oftentimes escalating to violence, primarily, especially under British rule. Eventually, after the Second World War, world opinion throughout, even in the USSR, started shifting towards supporting the Zionist settlers because of the Holocaust and all kinds of other things which were happening back then. In 1948, the Zionist forces managed to establish the State of Israel, deported or quote-unquote evacuated hundreds of thousands of indigenous Palestinians. Most of them, almost all of them, are not able to return to Palestine to this day. In 1967, Israel, in the Six-Day War, occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, as well as other territories, which until this day are held in military occupation. And the millions of Palestinians living in those territories are essentially at the mercy of Israeli military occupation forces and Israeli settlers. The Gaza Strip, which is a piece of territory near Egypt, is currently controlled by a Palestinian Islamic political party called Hamas. And what happened in the past week or so is that in response to escalating settler violence in Jerusalem and elsewhere, this Islamic party Hamas started launching rocket attacks on Israeli cities, and Israel retaliated in continuously bombing the Gaza Strip. And for the past week or so, this exchange of artillery is ongoing. At the same time, Palestinians within Israel and the West Bank basically started revolting. In many cases, this was petered out into race riots and a lot of vandalism and stuff like that. Although there were also cases of violent attacks against random people, which in response triggered Israeli right-wing militias to attack Palestinians as well. So, in short, extreme violence in the past week, both on the military front and internally. So that's the short summary of the situation we're in now.
Do we know how many people have been killed? Like the first reports on the Finnish news about this said that like 9 Israelis had died and that Israel had killed literally like 100 Palestinians or something.
Let's check the latest data. Earlier today, I saw 61 Palestinian children who died in Gaza. On the Palestinian side, over 230 dead and 12 Israeli dead so far. There's other data here as well about 6,000 injured Palestinians. Terrible situation.
Is the Israeli military just like bombing places where people live? How do they kill so many people?
The thing is, this Gaza Strip, it's one of the most crowded places on the planet. And a lot of the territories there is urban. And the Israeli military officially claims that they're only targeting like military targets, and that it's not our fault that the Palestinians are putting their weapons inside their schools and stuff like that. But then, in complete cognitive dissonance, they also say stuff like, we're deliberately toppling skyscrapers, or I don't know if you can even call them skyscrapers, like apartment blocks, because it's a symbolic attack on whatever. So, there isn't, as far as I know, there isn't like a coherent line on this. As far as I know, they just bomb things in the middle of the towns there, which may or may not have military targets in them. I think that this question is of like, instead of going participating in this discourse, in this quote unquote debate on whether or not it's military targets, we should instead of simply negating these arguments, we should also negate the negations and just explain why it doesn't even matter in the first place if there are military targets as well.
So I understand that historically, the conflict has kind of been about Israel trying to basically expand and steal more Palestinian territory, and
well, I think that the Zionist project has obviously, like, different political parties probably have different ideas, but generally the idea is to keep a Jewish majority country uh, and have it in a place of, I suppose, regional dominance. I would guess that's what they eventually want. I don't think this necessarily means that they will always want more land, although I suppose every colonial society has this incentive. What's happening now is a particular blend of ideological religious Zionism, which has a specific interest in colonizing. So this brand of extreme far-right religious Zionists definitely do want to get as much land as possible and Judaize it. And they have various tactics of doing this. In the what basically started this round of violence was the continued colonization of the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, which essentially has within this Palestinian neighborhood Jewish religious hardcore settlement, which is a few houses or buildings, and from that center, they essentially terrorize the entire neighborhood, petition the courts to deport the inhabitants. In the recent weeks, armed settlers start going through houses, threatening the families there. The idea is to put as much pressure on the Palestinian inhabitants so that they would hopefully for the Zionists, leave on their own accord. And this is something that they also do in the West Bank currently.
So these Israeli Zionist settlers, they just basically terrorize the Palestinians and in the neighborhood and hope hope that they would scare them to leave.
Yeah, they have all kinds of tactics. What we're seeing now is the most violent of them.
How did this violence and basically terrorism by the settlers, how did that escalate into this, like basically full blown, like the IDF just bombing Gaza?
Israel had election in March, and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is currently under a lot of public criticism and a lot of scrutiny because he was being indicted for corruption on several charges. There was a mass movement of Israelis against him, which caused the government to fall last year, and elections were called. In these elections, Netanyahu gave a lot of support for the extreme far-right parties and groups, like the most far-right elements of the Zionist movement. People who believe that they are bringing the Messiah by cleansing the land, people who openly support the massacres of Palestinians, what we call Kahanism. After Meir Kahane was basically a Jewish Hitler. He did the Jewish Defense League in America, which was involved in terrorism against Soviet targets. And these people got a lot of support from Netanyahu. And in fact, it was enough to get them seats in the Israeli parliament. So for the first time since the 90s, these extreme fascist groups have political representation. Not only that, they get a lot of coverage and attention by the media. So they're ruined. I have no idea why the media who are targeted by them keep bringing them to speak. It seems very like suicidal to me, but I don't know. Go figure, bourgeois. So anyway, these far right people led by this dude called Benjamin, they saw that we, the communists, Palestinians, have been organizing protests against the Jewification of Sheikh Jarrah. If you remember, there was like it became an international thing. People started talking about it all over the internet and stuff like that. So in response to our protests, this Jewish Nazi dude decided to move his parliamentary office into the neighborhood, into the Jewish settlement within the neighborhood. After that, after the outrage started, it was right at the climax of the Ramadan. Israeli police decided to basically both prevent people from coming to Jerusalem, to Temple Mount, to celebrate Ramadan, and those who did came into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is like the third holiest place for the Muslims around the world. They decided to break up the prayer or the worship inside with flashbang grenades, tear gas, injuring over 200 people in this crackdown, which resulted in a lot of violence. This was right around when Israel was celebrating the quote-unquote reunification of Jerusalem. So in response on this, during this celebration, Hamas started firing rockets.
So these Zionist fascist terrorists basically went into a mosque during Ramadan and started like...
No, this was the police.
The police? Israeli police?
Yep.
Damn, I mean, I'm even getting confused. Like, I can't even tell, like, the difference between the...
Not much of difference.
Yeah, okay, damn.
In the West Bank, the police stand alongside settlers while they're committing war crimes, basically. I have friends who are currently, like, serving the situation in the West Bank. And they send us videos of, like, just settlers shooting a Palestinian protesters, and police just standing by them, guarding them. And they say stuff like this is basically commonplace there.
So what happens now? Like, so there's protests against this, and you mentioned that there's gonna be a general strike.
Yeah, so just to clarify, alongside basically the war with Hamas, within Israel there has been massive race riots, essentially, where mostly in mixed ethnicity towns and cities, violent mobs, both of Palestinians and of Jews, have started committing ethnic violence against each other, which has resulted in deaths, a lot of property damage, including temples, mosques, and houses, businesses, etc. These race riots are organized by essentially the fringes in both populations. Majority of the people don't support the violence. Obviously, there's a difference between, like, dialectically speaking, there's a difference between the Palestinian riots and the Jewish riots, but in practice, they're essentially the same. Mostly young people, uh, just burning stuff, carrying flags, burning flags, throwing stones at cars, burning businesses of the other race, etc. Um, Generally, we at the left, uh, the Israeli Communist Party, have condemned the ethnic violence in general, and in fact, starting with an initiative of the Jerusalem branch of the Communist Party, which I'm in, we started organizing uh, essentially self-defense networks for Palestinian workers uh, who are a danger of being attacked while going back from work. So we arrange a network of mostly Jewish activists who escort them and defend them. And this initiative has spread to other cities in the country as well. We see a lot of success in this initiative. In addition to that, various anti-imperialist organizations, including the party, have started organizing joint Jewish-Palestinian protests against the violence and against the war throughout the country. Here in Jerusalem, we had several of these protests where we had hundreds of participants, which is a big achievement for Jerusalem, which is one of the most right-wing and most ethnically divided places perhaps in the world. In addition to that, yesterday, the Grand Council of Arab Affairs, probably not translating the name correctly, but the head organization of the Arab community within Israel, have announced that there's going to be a general strike for all Palestinians, demanding arresting Jewish rioters and stuff related to the violence from their side. And in fact, today we had many, in fact, very large portions of the economy were basically shut down because a lot of sectors are very heavily dependent on Palestinian labor. And this both includes Palestinians from the West Bank and Palestinian citizens of Israel. So, from what I can see, the strike has been successful, although there are also reports of business owners, Jewish business owners, who threatened to fire the Palestinian workers who participated in the strike, which is something we're also waging some legal struggle against currently. So that's in general what's been going on now. And yeah, the strike was organized by various organizations, including the Communist Party. The leader of the council I mentioned before is a former Communist Party parliamentary. So the party itself is very involved in a lot of these events.
what should the rest of us in other countries do about this? Like, obviously, there's been protests against, mainly, I would say, against the actions of the Israeli military, but obviously, there's also counter protesters who defend Zionism and whatnot. But what should we, the rest of us, think about this, and what should we do?
I think that all those who consider themselves anti-imperialists should organize political pressure on their own governments to withdraw support and sanction Israeli imperialism and drum up support for Palestinian national liberation. In my opinion, one of the conditions for ending colonialism here is international support for Palestine, which has been growing in past decades. We see a lot of people around the world supporting ending the occupation of Palestine, which is something wasn't really that widespread in the past. I would suggest not to target Israeli or Jewish targets in protests. I don't think that would have much of an effect. But if various Western European countries, governments are pressured into not supporting Israel, that would be very good, I think.
That's a good point. Yeah, like you told me earlier that if you protest in front of the Israeli embassy or something, they probably won't care. But we should instead try to get our own governments to denounce Israel. And I mean, I suppose like economic sanctions would be ideal, but that's probably very hard to achieve.
I would imagine it would be very difficult, especially for Western European countries, because I know that there are all kinds of like sectors in which Israel is quite important for trade. So I imagine a lot of Western European countries would be difficult to influence in this direction. But I think it's also possible. The European Union, as far as I know, is already has a more leftist position than Israel. So I think they would already are inclined to have Israel move less towards the right. I think I should bring up because I see a lot of communists and leftists who give unconditional support to the Hamas party, um, which I think is incorrect because Hamas has a position, in my opinion, which weakens the cause of Palestinian liberation. Because in order for there to be a chance for successful national liberation in Palestine, I think that Palestinian united front is a necessary prerequisite. This existed in the past in the form of the PLO, which still exists, but in the past decades, since the 90s and 80s, the PLO has been more and more sidelined by the Hamas party and other Islamic movements. Now, not only does this cause division within the national movement of Palestine, it also leaves the national movement itself in the hands of essentially a reactionary party. Now, obviously, you may call them progressive in comparison to Israeli occupation, but even then, Israel has said in the past that they prefer Hamas to the PLO, that they deliberately support Hamas financially, or at least they allow all kinds of things to get to Hamas, specifically to weaken the PLO. In the 80s and 90s, Israel actively funded and armed the Hamas movement specifically for this reason. And I can send you some sources about that as well.
Yeah, I think from a theoretical point of view, I understand it that people they think that to be a principled anti-imperialist, you always have to support anti-imperialism, and they see Hamas as being against Israeli imperialism, and therefore they have to support it, even if they don't necessarily like Hamas in and of itself. But, the correct principled thing to do and the theoretically correct thing to do is to analyze the situation and see, okay, yes, if Hamas actually serves the interest of anti-imperialism, then okay, sure, good. But in this situation, it kind of looks like they're making the situation worse, that they don't actually serve the interest of anti-imperialism, but they actually give Israel a perfect excuse to do what they're doing.
When Israel first supported them, I don't think Israel wanted them to be as violently opposed and so successful in opposition as they are now. And in another way, the PLO has essentially become real controlled opposition. In the 90s, the PLO and Israel have signed this agreement, which gives them some autonomy over some territory, and they have essentially since, in many instances, been part of the occupation. Although I still think that if there was a progressive party, then we should support it leading the National United Front. But yeah, in terms of actually resisting imperialism, I don't think Hamas actually served this. Not only is their strategy of military victory against Israel not possible, I think now, they serve as a barrier towards two things which are very important. One of them is, as I've said before, the national unity of Palestinians under a progressive party, and the other is the growth and existence of an anti-imperialist movement within Israel. What you said about them being a perfect excuse, that's true, but even before the Hamas, the leftist parties of Palestine served that exact same role because they were also very militant and they often targeted civilians as well. The Democratic Front and the People and the Popular Front, they also. And Hamas is probably worse because Hamas, at least in the past, have been much more openly genocidal towards Jews as a whole. So it's very difficult to convince Israelis that we should not attack Gaza when they're in power. But I don't think that on its own is enough of an argument because, the occupying nations will always call the freedom fighters terrorists, even if they're not, and even if they are.
Yeah, I would imagine that no matter what the Palestinians do, it's going to be difficult to convince the Israelis that Israel is wrong on this.
Yeah, Israel is very good in indoctrinating Jews into supporting Zionism. And for some people, it's a religious thing, although the majority of the people here are not particularly religious. The support from Zionism here mostly comes from existential dread that's been drilled into the minds of everyone, basically ever since they're born. It's very common to think here that without Israel, there's definitely going to be a second Holocaust. That's essentially something that's being taught at schools, and sometimes even with these words exactly. That's why Israel is trying to brand anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism.
Is there anything else that you think we should talk about?
I think that we should leave on an optimistic note because I do think that from what I've seen, more and more Israelis are participating in anti-war and anti-imperialist movements, and the actions of the Palestinian community within Israel has been kind of really encouraging to see how a lot of people participated in the strike. And I hope that we can get stronger from this. And I hope that we will see liberation soon.